Welcome. We've recorded a webinar for the Mass Fresh Core Grant. So my name is Abby Getman-Skillicorn. I'm joined by my colleague at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, Maggie Nowak, and we are here to provide this information session for schools and districts and early education programs about this exciting new grant opportunity. So just to run you through our agenda, we'll do brief introductions. Again, my name is Abby, and we'll go over what Farm to School is, more about the Mass Fresh Core funding overview and the eligibility. There will be a review of specific sections of today's application, and we'll provide resources and where you can ask questions later on in the presentation. And Maggie, do you want to do a brief intro and just say hi?
Sure thing. My name is Maggie Nowak. I use she, her pronouns, and I work for the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's Office for Food and Nutrition. We're really excited about the release of this grant opportunity, and I serve as the local food system specialist for the office. So I am excited to help in any way that I can.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. And you'll see both of our contacts later on in the presentation, but you can certainly reach out to Maggie as it relates to any GEMS related questions, and me as it relates to kind of content of what you might be applying for. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Mass Farm to School, it is a statewide nonprofit that works to strengthen local farms and fisheries by promoting healthy communities and increasing local food purchasing and education in our schools. So we host a variety of professional learning opportunities, networking. We work on policy and advocacy, especially around funding for initiatives like this. And we also have communications initiatives like our Harvest in the Month program, which you see cards of on the side of the screen. We're also the contracted outreach partner with the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's Office of Food and Nutrition Programs on the Mass Fresh Grant. So for those of you who are relatively new to Farm to School, we generally talk about the 3 C's of Farm to School, and this really comes from our colleagues in Vermont who came up with a trifecta of classroom, cafeteria, and community. And so when you're really executing great Farm to School programming, it means that you have different efforts that are showing up in these different places in your learning environment. So it's not just lessons that might involve the school garden or cooking with students. It's not just local procurement in school cafeterias or community service activities that are connecting you your learning environment to farms or to other initiatives, but it's really what we like to do is support programs that are really trying to weave those 3 avenues together for a comprehensive and integrated approach to support student learning. A little bit more about the Mass Fresh Core grant. So Mass Fresh Core stands for Farming Reinforces Education and Student Health with Coordination and Optimization of Resources and Partnerships. So this is a grant program that's being offered through the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So it's through DESE. You will need to use the GEMS grant platform, which Maggie will get into a little bit later. And the intended grant length is 16 months. So the expectation is that for several months, for about 4 months for the remainder of this fiscal year, there would be an award where activities would be completed, and then another 12 months for fiscal year 26 activities. And grant awards are can range between $30,000 or $150,000 over those 2 fiscal years. So just when you're thinking about your grant proposals, really to be thinking about how to spend down or have project activities that are happening both at the, in the spring of this school year and certainly next fiscal year as well. And DESE has around $575,000 available to award to programs across the 2 fiscal years. And the purpose of this grant, it's really to develop internal staff capacity to create lasting, sustainable farm to school programming in classrooms, cafeterias, communities, in early education programs, and pre-K through 12 settings. So we know that these activities can't happen without efforts of many. And what we've also learned within our state and within our region and nationally is that programs can really thrive and accelerate when there is internal staff capacity that's really coordinating these activities. So applicants should really consider how farm to school activities can elevate both the local food system education that would be happening in your learning environment, as well as local procurement for your child nutrition programs. Applicants in that thread, applicants must be a sponsor of the National School Lunch Program or the Child and Adult Care Feeding Program, so NSLP or CACFP. And if it is a CACF program, it must be a licensed early education program or a sponsoring organization of family daycare providers. Whereas for the National School Lunch Program, schools and districts must be NSLP sponsors that are serving students up to 12th grade. And what's exciting about this grant too is that application proposals can allow for collaboration across multiple, school districts or early education programs, but all the partners must be eligible entities. So for example, while a regional high school might have several elementary schools that are technically different districts that feed into it, an application could come from that one community where it's uniting the elementary schools, middle schools, and a regional high school as one example of what a collaboration could look like. A little bit more about the funding use. So the Mass Fresh Core grant should support one or more of the following areas, which is the creation of a new full-time salaried and benefited position, the creation of a new part-time position, the expansion of a current part-time position into a full-time salaried and benefited position, a new or expanded stipend structure that provides compensation for internal stakeholders like educators, nutrition professionals, staff, or families that are coordinating those farm to school activities above and beyond their established job description or role existing in the learning in the school or early education community, or to hire a contractor to provide technical assistance like coaching, professional development, or strategic planning to help really build capacity within the current staff. So those professional development fees or the infrastructure, it can be requested in addition to one of those like top 5 areas of capacity building that I previously mentioned. And equipment and supply costs are only allowed up to 10% of the total budget request. The intention really is to be supporting the personnel and the professional development or the real coordination that's behind the efforts that can make farm to school programming come to life in your schools or early education programs. A little bit more about, so in today's webinar, what we'll go over are the following application components. So you can access the grant on DESE's website. It is fund code 0723 for those who are looking for it in GEMS. And any of the highlighted sections we'll be covering in our webinar today. So we'll be covering a little bit more detail about what we're asking or what DESE is asking for as far as the child nutrition programs, all through both the fiscal year budgets. So just as an overview, you can reference these slides as you're going through your application. For the child nutrition programs, the information that you'll need, it does not need to be your school food authority director. It doesn't need to be the food service director that's filling out this application, but information that you'll need to get from them, if you don't already have it, includes the sponsor agreement number. So this is a unique number to every school food authority or CACFP program. You'll need to list which sites will be impacted by the grant and specifically what types of meals are served. So if it is a K through 12 school district, you would list all the schools that will plan to be impacted, or if it's going to be a set cohort of either schools, or if it's a early education CACFP sponsor for family child care centers, the sponsor would list specifically what childcare, family childcare centers would be part of this application. It's really, it's necessary to also provide a little bit more information around the meal preparation method. So if meals served in these environments are heat and serve, if they're vended meals, or if they're made from scratch for students, and a little bit of detail about the current local procurement or farm to school / early education activities that are already happening. So if your program is already offering taste tests, that's something that would be really helpful to know about in the application, or you're sourcing, local foods, but you haven't been able to do something like invite a farmer in or to run a taste test, those kinds of things. It's not required. It's not required to already be doing these existing activities, but it is required to answer the question as far as where you're at in your farm to school journey. For the existing program snapshot, we do want to know more about not just what's happening in the cafeteria, but across the 3 C's. So classroom, cafeteria, community, and the intersection. So if you can provide examples in each category of if you're doing any kind of existing farm to school programming in your classroom settings, like taking care of a school garden or working with hydroponics or doing cultural lessons around food sovereignty. Those could be examples of what's happening in your classroom environments. Cafeteria suggestions or examples I just listed on the previous slide. And then in the community, if you do already host farmer field trips or do a celebration harvest meal or work with a community farm or nonprofit or contract with an education provider that does additional work to weave farm to school throughout programming across grades, those are relevant activities that you would want to provide. The goal is not to tell us everything and be exhaustive of all the current programming, but to really demonstrate the existing efforts that are already happening in your school or learning environment so that the grant evaluators can understand where your program is and where your project is designed to take you. So for that existing snapshot, some of the you will need to complete a work plan. So the work plan would include detail around the activities that you are planning to do. So an example could be hosting an all-site planting day in the garden, which would be targeted towards students, and you would articulate if it's new programming and how many students that would plan to be impacted by this activity. And then you would provide more detail as far as how you're weaving across different target audience groups in the detail of that. So something to note is that there are drop-down options in areas in the application under the audience, and if it's a new or existing activity that's been completed in previous years. Additional in the application, you'll need to provide a job description or a scope of work because this application is really geared at helping build capacity in your program. And so DESE really wants to ensure that programs are, upon a board, really ready to go and initiate the hiring process, or to initiate the process to retain a consultant or contractor to help with that scope of work. So, in the capacity building activities, it will be required to have the job description. There are specs related. Take a look at this slide as far as the length of the, not to exceed 2 pages for a job description, Times New Roman font, single spaces, etc. And in addition to the job description or position description, you'll really want to make sure that you're having, if it's a job description for a new position that you're planning to hire, You'll want to have the job title, the position supervisor and reporting structure, et cetera. If it's a position description, that's really designed more for the type of stipend structure that if you're planning to execute that, that avenue of your project, which would again include the position title, the structure, the working environment, eligibility. And what's really key in all of these buckets is the overview as far as the duties and responsibilities of the main tasks that these staff members or these contractors would really be expected to perform over the course of the grant term. Okay, another part of the application will be the onboarding timeline for either hiring and retaining personnel or to hire and onboard a contractor. So just being transparent in the anticipated timeline of what your awarded program will be able to do upon receipt of award. If your program would be able to onboard and hire a new staff position within 6 weeks, or if it would take more 6 weeks. So they're asking for transparency around anticipated timeline of how your program expects to move forward. The project impacts is something that will look at the anticipated qualitative and quantitative impacts of your fresh core funding. So if you're planning to initiate new food systems education activities or new local procurement activities, those would fall into the qualitative bucket, whereas quantitative would get at the number of additional students or educators or nutrition staff or families, et cetera, that you anticipate being impacted by the activities related to your grant activity. Included in the application is also the letter of intent section. So all applications are required to submit one letter of intent, and that must be from the superintendent, chief executive, or the executive director as it's applicable in your school or early education program structure with a human resources representative. And the impetus behind this is really to ensure that your program is ready to act upon receipt of award. So going back to that timeline of implementation, that the leaders in your organization know that you're applying for this grant, are fully behind it, and are really ready to take action once DESE has notified your program if you're one of the grant recipients. A letter of letters for contractor interest. If an applicant is planning to use funds to hire a contractor, a letter of support is required from a potential contractor with the expertise to execute that scope of work. And that's really so that the contractor could speak to the experience that they have in supporting the local food system education or procurement and their ability to accomplish scope of work as outlined in the application. This is not to say that should a contractor include a letter of support in this application that your program would have to work with that contractor upon receipt of award. You would need to do your own solicitation or procurement process that may be necessary. An additional letter that would be necessary, especially if the application is on behalf of multiple districts, as in my example earlier of a regional school district, high school working with other school districts within that same community that may be from elementary schools. All of those additional schools that plan to work together under one grant application would need to provide letters of support. So if it's the high school applying as the applicant body, the elementary schools in that district would also need to provide letters of support saying, yes, we're really excited to work on this partnership program. And the partners must be CACFP or NSLP sponsors and could apply for this program within their own right.
And Abby, I'll just add to that slide that
yes,
that
please.
letter of partnership is only necessary if you're going to be doing sharing a grant application across multiple sponsors of a child nutrition program. So if you're just applying as a district or an early education program, you have your own sponsorship agreement number, you're one entity. You do not need to submit a letter of partnership. We're all set. You don't need.
But just to underscore, the minimum related documents, you'll definitely need to have at least job description or scope of work and a letter of intent. Additional letters that might be additional elements that might be project specific as documents that you would need to upload in your application might include letters of support that we just covered. So with this grant opportunity, because it spans 2 fiscal years, it also will require 2 budgets, one for this fiscal year. So for the remaining months of fiscal year 25, anticipating that there would be 4 months of spend down for that, and the 12 months for the fiscal year 26 budget. Allowable costs within the budget can include salaries and associated costs, including indirect fringe benefits. If there are stipend payments that you are budgeting for, if you're planning to hire a contractor, etc. The last section that I'll talk about for now includes the budget narrative. And so with the budget narrative table, it's broken out between fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26 budgets. And so really use this table to explain how the budget requests will support the staff capacity in building preparation for your project activities. So if the budget item is to attend a conference as an example of a professional development category, you would include those elements. There are drop-down features that are provided for you in the GEM system. And from that, I will turn it over to Maggie.
Thanks, Abby. That was really comprehensive. We really appreciate it. I'll add one note about the slide above, which is the budget narrative, and then dive into GEMS, which is the idea of a budget narrative. It is distinctly different from actually filling out the GEMS budget. And what we really are looking for here is that entity is explaining if the cost is not the actual payment of a stipend or a salary, how it relates to supporting that internal capacity building. And so while we do expect that you're going to list all of your costs in the budget narrative, including salary or stipend payments, we really want you to, have specific focus in your description on those costs that are in the realm of professional development or equipment or supplies. And we really need you to help us understand how those costs are going to go back and support that internal capacity building of a full-time staff member or stipends, etc. But let's jump into GEMS. Great. So for folks who are unfamiliar, DESE has changed its management platform of grants from EdGrants to GEMS, which is a cloud-based fiscal and program management grant system. So this is true for all grants that are managed out of the Office for Food and Nutrition as of school year 2024-2025, not just Mass Fresh. And it's true for all DESE grants. So it is a system that you will want to become familiar with if you are applying for grants from the Department of Education. GEMS requires a distinct login and assigned role for every user. So every person who might be involved with your grant is going to need a login, and to have access to a specific grant, the role of a universal access administrator will need to assign you a specific role to the grant. So there is typically within every organization one user access administrator, and I'll discuss in a moment if you are new to GEMS and that have not been set up yet, how you'll go about having someone identified to that role. And that user access administrator is going to assign you as the applicant the role of an LEA grant writer. This is going to be the first step in completing the application. You're going to take, be the person drafting responses. The LEA grant writer role can be granted to more than one individual. So if you're sharing the responsibilities of writing the grant, that is something that is able to be shared. Yeah, it's important that every grant to be completed has an LEA grant writer. Otherwise, you will not be able to begin the application process. Next slide. Great. So once you have been given a login to GEMS, if you're new to GEMS or if you have your login, and again, this is something a user access administrator in your entity can give you, you're going to go ahead and log in and you're going to want to search for funding applications. And actually we will share some navigation advice in a separate webinar, but another way to go about searching grants in the left navigation is through a distinction that says funding, which I see is not pictured here, but you can similarly press on funding and look at all of the grant opportunities that are open to your district or early education center. And if you are an eligible applicant for Mass Fresh Core, that grant will show up for you. But if you use this first route, you're going to go through the search engine and make sure that you're on fiscal year 2025 and find fund code 0723 for the Mass Fresh Core grant. All right, next slide. Great. So some quick tips and tricks when you're finishing the budget before we jump into GEMS, and I don't have this articulated on the slide. But when you go into the application, you're going to see that when you review questions, they're going to be grayed out. And so the way that you can start to actually fill out your application is at the very top of the grant, you'll be prompted as the grant writer to start the application. You'll press that hyperlinked button. It'll ask you to confirm. And once you confirm, you will then be able to fill out pieces of the questions that Abby described throughout the webinar here. Specifically for the budget, you're going to be brought to this table on the left and have the opportunity to modify and add your line items for your budget. And so that is a 3-step process. You basically will go into the budget section of GEMS. You'll then select modify in the appropriate category where that line item would fall. And then to add the specific budget line item, you're going to say add budget detail, and we'll go to the next slide in one moment. I do want to call attention to the fact that the budget page for any applicant is going to have a box on the top that generates indirect cost. It basically will show you as a school district or as an early education center who has an approved indirect cost rate, the total amount that you could potentially integrate into your application. This is merely a calculator. I know it has a prominent place on the page, but you do not have to integrate indirect costs. This is just a reference tool for you. And if there is an amount listed in the top in that box, it is not actually part of your budget unless you, for the budget itself, object code 8, add that dollar value into your budget. So just know that resource is there for you. You can ignore it, you can leverage it. And if you're an early education center that doesn't have an approved indirect cost rate with DESE, that is a process that you can go through after the grant process has been, if you have been awarded. And it's something that you can budget for tentatively and then be amended after the award process if necessary. And then again, friendly reminder at the bottom, equipment and supply costs in the budget cannot exceed more than 10% of your total budget for either fiscal year. Next slide. Great, so when you press into that add budget item, this is what you're going to see. So you're going to be prompted to provide an object code. That object code is basically the high-level category you're going to select into. So it should automatically be selected, but you can change it from this navigation. You're then going to be asked to give a function code. And DESE has a resource within GEMS on the home page under DESE resources. It's called a chart of accounts. And this will provide you more definitions to help you define the function code of the budget item you're requesting. This grant is pretty limited in terms of really being focused in staff salaries, in stipends, etc. So the funding codes will probably be pretty limited to just a few categories, but if you need further reference. And then lastly, you'll be prompted to put the quantity of the item or service. If you are describing a contractor rate by hours, that might be the number of hours. Or if the contract is just a total value, you'll need to explain how that's calculated in the narrative description, but the quantity is going to be one contract. And then you're going to add that cost in the cost section. And again, just a reminder, the narrative description and the budget description are different. So the narrative description here in the budget is really just, this is the place where you say what this line item is. It's the purchase of lumber. It's a stipend position for a nutrition professional. It is the fringe benefit for a salaried position. That's what your narrative description will tell us. And then when you go back and fill out the budget narrative, you're going to tell us how that line item relates to your overall project. Next slide. Great. And then because of the functionality of GEMS, you're going to see that the fiscal year 26 budget looks a little different. Navigating is a little different. The components we're asking for are the same. You're going to give an object code, a function code, just the amount. We didn't add quantity here, and a description. And please describe how that amount is calculated in your description. We were only able to use one of the big fancy budgets in the application, so this is kind of a duplication, but we want to make sure that you are articulating distinctly the money you're asking for in fiscal year 25 and then the money you're asking for in fiscal year 2026. Please budget as accurately as possible in both of these budgets and make sure that they remain separate. There is no option to roll over funding that you have allocated in 2025. So the money that you set aside for 2025 and 2026 is set. There will not be a way to expand or roll over. So it's really important that you calculate that as accurately as possible. Next slide. Great. And then a few things to note on unallowable costs. So three high-level unallowable costs is you can't request funding for food or, food cost items that will be integrated into a reimbursable school meal. And you can't sell food items or things developed from the project as a competitive food or beverage or fundraiser within, your entity. And then grant awards are to fund new activities. So the grant awards cannot fund existing positions or activities. For example, if you already have garden coordinators in your school district and you're looking for a funding source for them for 2026, this is not the grant for sustaining that activity. But if you're looking to add 2 new garden coordinators to a specific location, this grant could pay for those additional expanded garden coordinator positions. So it does need to be distinctly a new activity. And then just a note again about that indirect cost calculator that's available to you. And then high level, an additional note related to related documents. So those letters of intent, letters of support, those job descriptions, those are going to be uploads within the application. So you're going to draft them in Word or PDF and then upload them into GEMS. And you'll be prompted to do that in the application itself. When you navigate in GEMS, you're going to see a section that's called Related Documents. You don't need to do anything with that section. When you do an upload within the required grants question section, the document will appear in both places. You can certainly check your related documents section to make sure everything is uploaded in there, but it does the job for you. You upload the document once and you should be all set. Next slide. Great. And then last but not least, this is a really important part of GEMS. If you are familiar with applying for grants with DESE in the former process with Ed Grants, you might remember a Part 1 standard contract form. And that was really the process to ensure that your grant was signed by a project manager, grant writer, as well as your fiscal and superintendent or executive director lead. This is now all done digitally in GEMS. And the order of operations is that the grant writer is going to write the content for the grant and submit. Then your fiscal representative, who needs to have a login in GEMS, is going to be prompted automatically in the system to approve that grant. And once they approve it, it will lastly go to the superintendent or executive director for final approval. All 3 of those individuals have to provide approval by the deadline. If only 2 or 1 of those steps is followed, DESE does not consider that a submitted grant and will not review it or consider it for application or award. So please ensure depending on your role, no matter what your role is, you are able to see in GEMS whether or not the LEA superintendent has approved or executive director has approved your grant and it's submitted. So, if you're a grant writer, that is really something to monitor and make sure of. There is no exception in a competitive process for the lack of approval for all three entities. So do make sure you give yourself enough time to do that approval process. And grants are due January 17th, which I think Abby mentioned earlier. Right. So yes, as Abby, I think already alluded to, this is the landing page on DESE's website for the request for proposals. So this really goes through a lot of the information we've already talked through today. It provides the instructions for how to apply and all of the priority areas, examples, etc. It also has links directly to GEMS to get you to the website. But it's important that you take another read through the request for quotes to make sure you're capturing everything required. Next slide. Great. Awesome. And then one exciting resource we're happy to provide as part of this grant is there is a template of basically all of the grant questions that are going to be required that lives outside of GEMS. So anyone is able to access this planning template. It is on the GEMS homepage, but does not require a login. So you're going to navigate on the homepage to DESE resources, competitive grants, planning template and document, and then you'll see our fund code 0723. And so this will be a Word document that encompasses all the questions that are asked in the grant. It is for planning purposes only. This is not something that you can submit to anyone at DESE to be considered applying for the grant. You have to get a login to GEMS and apply. But we hope this is a helpful resource for planning and for access to folks who maybe won't be involved in the GEMS process, but have input to put into the application. So please, check that out. And then DESE will be managing questions through a Q&A page on DESE's website. And all questions do need to be submitted for the grant by December 20th. And we'll have answers provided. We won't be providing answers this round directly via email. Due to the competitive nature of the grant, we'll collect your questions, send you an acknowledgement email, and then we'll follow up with you within a week or less when the answer is posted to the question and answer public facing page. So great. And you can email those questions on to me. My email will be on a few of these slides. I'm going to pass it back to Abby.
Thanks, Maggie. So yes, that QR code on the screen, that is a QR code that brings you to the Mass Fresh Corps RFP on DESE's website. The questions are due to Maggie by Friday, December 20th. We think it's important to really underscore that. Those answers will be shared publicly no later than Friday, January 3rd. And just a few other resources that you have on Mass Farm to School's Mass Fresh grant page. If you are interested in hiring a new staff position or are thinking about, what are the job responsibilities or position descriptions, we have samples from a variety of districts here in Massachusetts, as well as from some of our partners in Vermont. And you can look at some of those position descriptions or scopes of work. There are also there's a list of different program partners should you want to work with a contractor. That is also available further down on that page if you are interested in starting a conversation with any of those contracted partners if they work in your area. As a reminder, Mass Farm to School, we do have our Harvest of the Month program, which does include both educational resources and resources for school nutrition professionals that you can sign up for throughout the school year. And we also have an ongoing professional development calendar, especially a series that we are launching this winter with Mass Audubon for early education professionals. So check out those resources as well. And then if you would like to, once you've seen this webinar, gone through the application and want to sign up for a mini grant coaching session with Mass Farm to School, you can use the QR code on the screen in front of you, and that would set up a time slot to have a conversation with me or one of my colleagues at Mass Farm to School to talk specifically about the application that your program may be looking to submit. And for any questions related to specifically, any questions that you want asked of Desi, those are due by December 20th. And specifically, GEMS related questions should really be directed to Maggie because Mass Farm to School does not have GEMS access. So important distinctions. We can talk about concepts. We can't necessarily talk about navigation in the grant program.
We're so grateful you're interested in Mash Fresh Core. We hope it's an opportunity that matches your current state with farm to school activities, and we are looking forward to applications. Get started as soon as you can. GEMS is a new platform for most people, and if you're brand new to GEMS, it is required that you request access to the system at least a week before the deadline of the grant, so that would be January 10th. And we look forward to helping provide any GEMS technical assistance you might need. And Mass Farm to School is a great sounding board for all of your project ideas. Thank you guys so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Take care.